Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, you'll find various videos produced in an effort to defend historic Christianity from alternative viewpoints that skeptics and others bring. I hope you'll find value in my work in the video that you're about to watch. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I look forward to receiving your feedback. Today, on Blessed Man Meditations, we're continuing our look at Paul Copan's Is God a Moral Monster? These are the contents of that book. Please pause the video if you want to get a closer look at all those contents. Here's Paul Copan. He got his PhD from the University of Marquette, and he is the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. He's written or edited over 20 apologetics and philosophy books. Lives in Florida. Chapter 5 in Is God a Moral Monster? Has to do with the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, child abuse and bullying. Does God advocate child abuse and bullying? So it starts by reading the chapter in Genesis, the excerpt from Genesis chapter 22. It came to pass, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said to God, Here I am. Then God said to Abraham, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Abraham said to his young men, Sit here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship. Come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, took the fire in his hand and a knife, and 2 of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And Isaac said to his father, Look, the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said to Isaac, My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together, and they came to a place of which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there, and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And the angel said to Abraham, Do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. The ram was the substitute for his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Occasionally, we'll read in the newspaper or hear on the evening news about certain deluded persons who have committed murder. What is their justification for committing that murder? Sometimes these deluded people will say, God told me to do it. Copan has heard some use this line to justify divorcing a spouse in order to marry their personal assistant at work, claiming that God told them to do so. God's name gets dragged into circumstances or actions that are wholly contrary to his good character. God certainly doesn't want the credit in such cases. So what do we do with God's startling command to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, verse 2, when God asked Abraham to take now your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering? As Copan will discuss later in this book, the law of Moses condemned such child sacrifice. In fact, this was one of the horrible practices for which God judged the Canaanites. So, then doesn't it seem that God's commands are whimsical and capricious in Genesis chapter 22? Why can't God just as well command murder as well as prohibit it? After all, it looks like he's doing just that to Abraham, that he's commanding murder. This is what one biblical scholar calls a monstrous test. Best-selling author Bart Ehrman, an agnostic, very famous, I guess, these days, comments on the aqueduct or binding of Isaac. Ehrman says, quote, "The idea that suffering comes as a test from God simply to see if his followers will obey is illustrated perhaps more clearly and more horribly in the offering of Isaac. Some scholars claim that Abraham failed the test by being willing to sacrifice his son. Others wonder how this act could serve as a test for godliness. Should Abraham be loved or hated for being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac?" The Danish Christian philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had a lot to say about this portion of Scripture. Abraham had a right to be a great man and thus do what he did, but when another does the same, it is sin, a heinous sin, said Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard said that God's command to Abraham suspended typical ethical obligations. God appears to use his authority to violate basic moral standards. God seems to be a relativist of sorts. At first glance, if we look at the bigger picture, perhaps we can place some of these troubling matters in proper context. Only then should we look at the specifics in Genesis 22. So what is the broader context of Genesis 22? Well, let's look at the theme of the Pentateuch, Abraham's faith and Moses' unbelief. Biblical scholars have pointed out that the theme of faith holds the Pentateuch, which is the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, together at the seams. The theme of faith holds those 5 books together at the seams. The 2 major players in the first 5 books are Abraham and Moses. Abraham is the positive example of faith, while Moses is the negative example of faith. Abraham had faith without the law of Moses, which was given at Mount Sinai. Despite his wavering, Abraham trusted God's promise, and so he was declared righteous by God. That's Genesis 15:6 and quoted in Romans chapter 4 by the Apostle Paul. By contrast, Moses actually failed in his faith, even though he lived under the law given at Sinai. Yes, Moses played a crucial role in Israel's history, but we see a critical failure of faith in Moses. It's no coincidence that when we have faith, or that when have faith or believe is mentioned in the Pentateuch, it is used positively before the giving of the law at Sinai in Exodus 20. Examples of have faith or believe being mentioned in the Pentateuch being used positively before the law include Genesis 15:6, Exodus chapter 4 verse 5, Exodus chapter 14 verse 31, and Exodus chapter 19 verse 9. However, these words are used negatively. In other words, not believing, did not believe after Sinai, such as in Numbers 14:11, Numbers 20 verse 12. As a cross-reference, you have Deuteronomy 1:32 and Deuteronomy 9:23. Pentateuch is in large part a contrast between Abraham and Moses. Though Abraham's faith wavered at times, it continued to grow. It is significant that Abraham trusted God and was declared righteous before the law of Moses came. Even without the law, Abraham kept the intention or purport of the law because he lived by faith. Genesis 26 verse 5 says, "Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Notice the words used. These are post-Sinai law terms used in Deuteronomy. Obeyed, charge, commandments, statutes, and laws, yet they apply to Abraham before the law was given. The point is to show how Abraham essentially kept the law and pleased God because he lived by faith. This connection wasn't lost on Paul in the New Testament, as Romans chapter 4 and Galatians chapters 3 and 4 bear out. As he read the Old Testament scriptures in light of his encounter with Christ, the Apostle Paul discovered that Abraham lived by faith and was declared righteous by God. That is Genesis 15. In Genesis 17 came the covenant of circumcision, and over 400 years later the law was given at Sinai. In other words, Abraham didn't need circumcision or the law to be right with God. On the other hand, Moses had the law, but he failed in his faith. This prevented Moses from entering the promised land across the Jordan. Moses is the negative contrast to Abraham. Though Moses had the law, Moses died in the wilderness because of his and Aaron's lack of faith at Kadesh. Moses wasn't barred from the promised land just because he struck the rock. He had struck rocks before. The Hebrew text makes clear that both Moses and Aaron displayed unbelief in their exasperation. Moses and Aaron were not trusting in God. Moses, along with Aaron apparently, cried out in frustration, "Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water from you out of this rock?" Psalm 106 In verses 32 and 33 reinforces the theme of Moses' unbelief. The rebellion of the people prompted Moses to speak rashly, not act rashly. Rash words came from Moses' lips. So because of the unbelief of both Moses and Aaron, God rebuked the both of them. When God said, because you, Moses and Aaron, the pronoun is plural, have not believed me to treat me as holy before Israel, you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I've given them. That's from Numbers chapter 20. Later in Deuteronomy chapter 32, we read again that Meribah and Kadesh, Moses broke faith with God. As a result of this failure of faith, Moses could not enter the promised land. God used Abraham as a picture of trust without the benefit of the law. Abraham serves as an illustration across the ages of how God's people should live. Moses turns out to be a negative example and a sobering reminder to legalistically minded Jews that having law and keeping it scrupulously are inadequate for being right with God. Rather, instead of law-keeping to be made right with God, we're to approach God trustingly, depending on God's grace and sufficiency, rather than putting confidence in our own sufficiency, just like when Paul said that he put no confidence in the flesh. This important theme of Abraham's deep trust in God's promise and faithfulness helped shape Israel's own self-understanding and identity. So it's not surprising to hear Moses' words to Israel at Sinai. Exodus chapter 20, verse 20, quote, "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test." The Hebrew word for test is nasa. God has come in order to test you and in order that the fear, Hebrew word yirah, of him may remain in you, so that you may not sin. So God tested them so that they would see whether or not the fear of God was in them, because the fear of God, it's by the fear of God that men depart from iniquity. These two key verbs link back to Genesis 22. Abraham was tested by God, and through his ordeal demonstrated his fear of God. Abraham's obedience is intended to serve as a model for Israel and to inspire Israel's obedience and solidify their relationship with God, their fear of God. In fact, one can make the case that the entire Pentateuch speaks to the success of faith in Abraham and the failure of faith in Moses, despite having God's law. So to focus only on God's single command to offer up Isaac misses the big picture. Now let's look at the broader context, the context of Abraham's call. Let's now take a look at how God begins dealing with Abraham in light of his overarching plan for the nation Israel. If we do so, we'll have a firmer grasp of what's going on with Abraham and Isaac. Otherwise, we'll likely distort the story in Genesis chapter 22. The first time, God told Abram, who became Abraham, to go, literally go, Lake Leka, when he first left his home in Ur of the Chaldeans, who were Babylonians. He left his land of Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land, the El-Eretz, which I shall show you. That's Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. This remarkable act of trust was based on this promise that God would make through Abraham and his descendants a great nation. That's coming from Genesis chapter 12, the first 3 verses. But in Genesis chapter 22, the second verse, God commanded Abraham once again to go, using the same construction, literally go, Lake Leka, followed by the familiar sounding, to one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Indeed, he is to go to the land, the region of Moriah. This time, Isaac, the covenant son of promise, is involved. Abraham couldn't have missed the connection being made. Bells are going off in Abraham's mind. God is clearly reminding Abraham of his promise of blessing in Genesis 12, even while he's being commanded to do what seems to be utterly opposed to that promise, murdering his son. In Genesis chapter 12, God had promised he would make Abraham's descendants as numerous as the stars. After Abraham's obedience, here God confirms his promise that he will make his offspring as numerous as the stars and the sand of the seashore. Genesis makes a connection between Abraham's call and his subsequent obedience. The firmness of faith in Abraham, the father of Israel, was being tested, and this moment would shape the thinking and identity of subsequent generations of Israelites. As one biblical scholar wrote, any Israelite who heard the story would take it to mean that his race owed its existence to the mercy of God and its prosperity to the obedience of their ancestor. Abraham had left his home in Ur and given up his past for the sake of God's promise. Now he was being asked if he would trust God by apparently surrendering his future as well. Abraham had ever hoped for was tied up in that son of promise, Isaac. Now we're going to look at the nearer context of Hagar and Ishmael. Here we come to the more immediate narrative context, namely what took place with Abraham's first son, Ishmael, and his mother, Hagar. The Ishmael story turns out to be a preliminary testing ground that informs Abraham's later experience. Let's not forget that Ishmael was born to Hagar, Sarah's maidservant. Sarah, with Abraham, assumed that her having a biological son in her old age wasn't going to work out. So Sarah, figuring that surrogate motherhood must be the way God wanted her to fulfill his promise, told Abraham to take care of Hagar as her substitute, as a second-tier wife. However, this turned out to be an ill-conceived plan, a misconception. We'll come back to this in a future chapter. When Hagar conceived and began to despise her mistress Sarah, this caused much tension, and Sarah drove her away. Yet God met Hagar in her desperation in the wilderness and told her to go back to live with Sarah and Abraham. There, Hagar gave birth to Abraham's first son, Ishmael. As Ishmael grew up, Abraham unquestionably became quite attached to his son. God, however, had different plans. He assured Abraham and Sarah that he wanted the son of promise to come from both their bodies, not just Abraham's. Through God's miraculous fulfillment of his promise, Isaac was born. But at the feast, when Isaac was weaned, Ishmael, now a teenager, mocked Isaac. It had been painful enough for Sarah to have her handmaiden Hagar, rather than herself, give birth to Abraham's first son. But for Ishmael, then to scorn Sarah's own biological child was just too much to take. Sarah wanted to send away not only Ishmael, but also his mother, Hagar. This created a dilemma for Abraham. Sending them off would calm Sarah down, but sending Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness meant encountering harsh circumstances and risks, possibly even death. But God allayed Abraham's fears, reassuring him that Ishmael would not die. In fact, Yahweh had already told him, "I will make him a great nation." Hagar herself had been told that God would greatly multiply her descendants. So Abraham could confidently send Ishmael away with Hagar and entrust them to God's care. Then we come to God's command to Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham had endured a difficult challenge regarding Ishmael, and he was aware of the promise God had made concerning Ishmael. Though Abraham had sent Ishmael away into the wilderness, God had promised that he would live and become a great nation. Without God's promise, Abraham would have been wrong to send Hagar and Ishmael away to almost certain death. So, despite Sarah's anger at Hagar and Ishmael, God assured Abraham that he would provide for Ishmael, and that Abraham need not worry that he was doing wrong. God would care for Ishmael and Hagar and would fulfill his promises to them. So Abraham rose early in the morning, in Genesis chapter 21:14, just as he would do with Isaac in Genesis 22:3, and sent them both away. In the background was not only God's assurance regarding Ishmael. God had also provided a miracle son to Abraham, a son who had come from Sarah's own body, your only son, Genesis 22, verse 2. The long-awaited son of promise would also become a great nation. Ishmael had been a preliminary test. Isaac would bring an even greater test. Abraham knew that God would fulfill his promise regarding Isaac, but he didn't know what God would do in the end. All he could do was trust God's promises and obey. Somehow, God had to come through. Abraham's obedience, we now see, was carried out in the proper context of his awareness of God's earlier deliverance of Ishmael and of God's act of providing the miracle child of promise through Sarah. So Abraham had this prior experience that God was a God who would work in difficult circumstances through the birth of Ishmael. So Abraham could have had expectations based on that previous experience that God would come through in this deal with Isaac as well. Now we're going to look at the text of Genesis 22. Having looked at the surrounding biblical text, we can hone in on Genesis 22. The text contains additional clues, some of them subtle, to help us better understand what takes place in this powerful, perplexing narrative. Because Abraham already knew God's faithful and even tender character and promises, he was confident that God would somehow fulfill his promise to Abraham, however this would be worked out. 4 things about God's character emerge as we work through Genesis 22. First, we're immediately tipped off to the fact that God is testing Abraham in verse 1. God does not intend for Isaac to be sacrificed. That's undeniable. No, Abraham isn't yet aware of what the reader knows, namely that this is only a test. Second, even the hard command to Abraham is cushioned by God's tenderness. God's directive is unusual. He says, "Please take your son," or as another scholar translated, "Take, I beg of you, your only son." God is remarkably gentle as he gives a difficult order. This type of divine command as a plea is rare. Old Testament commentator Gordon Wenham sees here a hint that the Lord appreciates the costliness of what he's asking. End quote. God understands the magnitude of this difficult task. In fact, one commentator states that God is not demanding here. Thus, if Abraham couldn't see God's broader purposes and so couldn't bring himself to do this, Abraham wouldn't incur any guilt in declining God's pleas. A third indication of God's good character highlights his faithfulness. God reminded Abraham of your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, in verse 2. God's covenant acknowledgement is apparent. The divine promise to Abraham can't be fulfilled without Isaac. Abraham is struggling to keep two things in mind. First, his deep love for Isaac is good and right, and the circumstances surrounding Isaac's birth clearly show that God was fulfilling his covenant promise to Abraham. While this is the most fearful and dreadful thing Abraham would ever have to do, he's trying to come to terms with just how God would fulfill his promise through Isaac. A fourth reminder of God's faithful character is that God is sending Abraham to a mountain in the region of Moriah, derived from the Hebrew word ra'ah, which means to provide, see, or show. As we noted earlier, the place which I tell you is linked back to God's initial call to Abram to go to the land which I will show you. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Abraham was also aware of God's provision for Hagar and Ishmael when they first fled. Hagar said, using the same Hebrew word ra'ah, you are a God who sees. So, in the very word Moriah, which means provision, we have a hint of salvation and deliverance. Gordon Wenham helpfully observes, quote, salvation is thus provided in the very decree that sounds like annihilation, end quote. In all these ways, we see God's faithful tenderness cushioning the startling harshness of God's command. It's as though God's saying to Abraham, I'm testing your obedience and allegiance. You don't understand, but in light of all I've done for you and said to you, Abraham, trust me. Not even death can nullify the promise I've made, end quote. God told Abraham that it wasn't Hagar who would bear the child of promise, even though Abraham with Sarah thought it would be a good idea. Oh, that Ishmael might live for you, in Genesis 17:18. God replied, no, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. Genesis 17:18 and 19. Genesis chapter 17, verses 18 and 19. God assured Abraham that Isaac, not Ishmael, was the promised son. So we can't separate God's promise in Genesis 12 and 17 from God's gentle command in Genesis 22. Abraham had confidence that even if the child of promise died, God would somehow accomplish his purposes through that very child. Abraham believed God could even raise Isaac from the dead. That's why Abraham told his servants before he headed to Mount Moriah with Isaac, quote, we'll worship and then we'll come back to you, in Genesis 22, verse 5. No wonder the author of the Hebrews observed that since Abraham had received the promises, he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead. In some way, God would fulfill his promises. Abraham was confident of this and commended for it. After all, Abraham confidently affirmed a few chapters earlier, shall not the judge of the earth deal justly? He knew God was just. And because he knew God was just, he knew that he had to know that what he was being asked to do in God's counsel could not be unjust, like the new atheists allege. Abraham knew that God's faithful character meant that God wouldn't break his promises. Not only is it impossible for God to lie, but after promising to make Abraham into a great nation and to bring his descendants into the promised land, God himself passed through the pieces of animals in a dramatic display of pyrotechnics. According to some scholars, this puzzling gesture of cutting a covenant indicates a self-curse. May I be like this cut-up animal if I don't fulfill my promise, God was saying of himself. Whatever a divine self-curse might mean, it shows how supremely dedicated God was to keeping his covenant. So what are some philosophical reflections on God's command to Abraham? If Abraham was commanded to take an innocent life, should we revise the sixth commandment, you shall not murder? We're left with the question, could taking an innocent life ever be morally permitted? Consider the following statements. Statement 1. God's command to do X obligates person Y to do X. Statement 2. It's wrong to kill innocent human beings. Statement 3. God commanded Abraham to take an innocent life. So can we hold all three of the above statements with consistency? We can accept statement 1 that we should do what God commands. After all, God's commands are rooted in his good nature and purposes. On the other hand, statement 2 normally holds, but we must consider the specific context to see whether it always holds apart from God's command. Could it be that under certain conditions, taking an innocent life might be morally justified? Take the specific case of an ectopic pregnancy. Fertilized human egg remains and grows in the woman's fallopian tube. If the embryo continues to grow without intervention, the mother will surely die. Ethicists generally agree in this tragic case that it's morally permissible to take an innocent human life. The reason given is a self-defense argument. Take the baby in order to protect the mother's life. For without intervention, both mother and baby will die. Now take the September 11th terrorist attacks. When 4 planes were hijacked, putting many more lives at risk than those of the innocent passengers, the president gave orders to shoot down the planes, which suddenly had become weapons. Again, while tragic, such a command was justified in an attempt to stop the killing of many more innocent persons. These exceptional cases permit the taking of innocent human life. All things being equal, such actions would be morally permissible. But let's explore further. What if the world of humans turned out to be different from the way we happen to find it? The philosopher John Hare provides this thought experiment. What if God arranged the world so that it had different features and thus different ways to apply moral principles? Say that God willed that at the age of 18 humans should kill each other, but that God would immediately bring them back to life in robust health. In that case, killing people at this age wouldn't be a big deal, or that big a deal. Yes, in this world, dead people stay dead. We're setting aside supernatural invention, of course. That is one of the reasons that killing innocent people in the actual world is wrong. Let's shift to the unique historical setting of Genesis 22. We've seen that the narrative context of Genesis reveals repeated divine assurances and confirmations that Isaac was the child of promise, the instrument of blessings to the nations. Abraham truly knew that Isaac would live to adulthood and have offspring in fulfillment of God's promise. So, if necessary, God would bring Isaac back from the dead. Abraham said, "We will return," when he promised his servants. So, if Abraham knew God would fulfill his covenant promise, then Abraham's taking an innocent human life in this case, according to God's command, was morally permissible. Because Abraham knew that he would return with Isaac, that God would raise him from the dead if necessary. Keep in mind that our ethical understanding is partly shaped by certain facts about the world. If we lived in a world in which hitting people in the head helped improve their health rather than causing harm and pain, then such actions would be encouraged. Yes, in the actual world, hitting people in the head usually causes harm. However, this illustration shows that the command "don't hit people in the head" depends on certain givens in the world. If certain facts about the world were different, then the command wouldn't be binding on us. So what if the facts about the world include a good God who specifically reveals himself and may issue extraordinary commands in specific, unique contexts and with morally sufficient reasons? That's the question. So the contention is that this episode with Abraham sacrificing his son, instead of God being a moral monster, because this is what he asks his people to do, this is the kind of God that he is, he asks his people to do this. No, this is a specific, extraordinary command in a specific, unique context, and a context in which God had morally sufficient reasons. Even if the critic believes the story of Abraham to be historically unreliable, that's irrelevant for our purposes here. Critics' arguments based on the assumption that this event is in accordance with the text. The critic's task then is to show why Abraham, given what he knew, shouldn't obey God's command. After all, God knew the outcome. That taking Isaac's life would only mean that God would resuscitate Isaac so that God's covenant promise would be fulfilled. Abraham knew that Isaac was the child of promise, so if Abraham is being asked to kill the child of promise, if God's promises are going to be fulfilled, which Abraham expects that God's promises are going to be fulfilled because Abraham has believed God and it's been accounted to him for righteousness, he's expecting Isaac, his son, to not stay dead. Yes, without God's command, which assumes covenant promises, Abraham would have been murdering his son, but that's not what we have here. We have seen that statement 2, taking innocent human life is morally wrong, has its own set of exceptions. The example we gave is an ectopic pregnancy. Such exceptions aside, the critic wrongly assumes that his statement's absolutely correct while ignoring or rejecting certain truths about reality. The critic's ignorant of a supernatural being who's able to bring people back from the dead. The critic rejects the fact that God acts in history, makes promises, makes good on them, and has morally sufficient reasons for doing what he does. Statement 2 applies in a world in which dead people don't come back to life after being killed. So, God's command wasn't immoral or contradictory. Now we're going to look at a New Testament perspective on Abraham and Isaac. Jesus is the second Isaac. Commenting on Genesis 22, agnostic skeptic Bart Ehrman, or atheist skeptic Bart Ehrman, observes, the God who had promised Abraham a son now wants him to destroy that son. The God who commands his people not to murder has now ordered the father of the Jews to sacrifice his own child. Obviously, Bart Ehrman did not consider these ramifications that Paul Copan has laid out. Yet, just as Caiaphas the high priest spoke better than he knew about Jesus in John chapter 11, verses 47 to 52, so Bart Ehrman is speaking better than he knows without embracing the theological implications. Let's back up a bit, though, to put things into perspective. In his book, The Crucified God, German theologian Jürgen Moltmann quotes the Jewish writer Eli Wiesel, who powerfully wrote in his book Night on his own horrifying experiences in the concentration camp Auschwitz. Wiesel recounts one event that's particularly moving. The SS hanged 2 Jewish men and a youth in front of the whole camp. The men died quickly, but the death throes of the youth lasted for half an hour. "Where's God? Where is he?" someone asked behind me, as the youth still hung in torment in the noose. After a long time, I heard the man call again, "Where is God now?" And I heard a voice inside myself answer, "Where is he? He's here. He's hanging there on the gallows." What is Moltmann's profound response to Wiesel's assessment? Any other answer would be blasphemy. The Christian takes strength and comfort in the fact that God suffers with us and even enters our suffering, particularly in the person of Jesus of Nazareth on the shameful, humiliating cross. Indeed, a God who doesn't suffer would make God a demon. An indifferent God would condemn human beings to indifference as well. The story of Abraham and his one and only son Isaac actually foreshadows God the Father's offering the redemptive sacrifice on the second Isaac, his one and only son. Rather than as being forced upon the son, divine child abuse, as Richard Dawkins calls it, the Father is not pitted against the Son. Yes, Richard Dawkins and the new atheists like to call this divine child abuse. But the Father is not pitted against the Son. Christ willingly laid down his life and then took it up again. He humbled himself, became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. Thus, there was not a conflict in the Godhead. God sent his Son into the world to bear Israel's and humanity's curse and alienation on the cross. Yet God, the Son, himself came into the world to save it. With three wills of Father, Son, and Spirit united as one, the triune God gave his very self to rescue and redeem humankind. With 3 wills of Father, Son, and Spirit united as one, the triune God gave his very self to rescue and redeem humankind. 2 Corinthians 5:19 says, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Abraham's unquestioning yet difficult obedience to the covenant God not only helped shape and confirm Israel's identity in Abraham, but also provided a context for understanding God's immense self-giving love in the gift of his Son. When Abraham's dedication to God's command was confirmed, God said, Abraham was about to plunge the knife into his son, and God said, "Stop, Abraham, stop." He said, "Now I know you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Harking back to Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, Paul uses this story to remind believers of God's supreme dedication to them. Romans 8:32. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac anticipated God's self-sacrifice in Christ. Abraham demonstrated his faithfulness to God, and God's sacrifice demonstrated his faithfulness to us. The kind of demand God made of Abraham was the one the triune God was willing to carry out himself. Let me read that one again. The kind of demand that God made of Abraham was the very one, that the triune God was willing to carry out himself. Abraham believed Isaac would rise from the dead. Jesus did rise from the dead. So deep is God's love for us that the late Scottish theologian Thomas Torrance was willing to go so far as to say that God loves us more than he loves himself. The New Testament perspective on Abraham and Isaac. Was the crucifixion divine child abuse? Yeah, that's cosmic child abuse line. That's a favorite of the new atheists. Richard Dawkins, we've seen, considers the command for Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as tantamount to child abuse and bullying. We've responded to this charge, but we should go further. Was the crucifixion an instance of divine child abuse? Does the crucifixion justify violence, or perhaps passivity, in the face of injustice? We've seen that the charge of abuse doesn't take into account the full scope of biblical evidence, as though crucifixion was forced upon the son. It was not. It was not. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 21 to 25. Christ voluntarily went for us. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. Who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but here it is, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. End quote. That's 1 Peter 2, 21 to 25. Christ went voluntarily. We have no passive victim here. Jesus' death on the cross was part of the predetermined plan of the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit. Each one suffered in this reconciling work. In weakness, Jesus actually conquered sin and the powers of darkness. According to John's Gospel, as we've seen, Jesus' moment of being lifted up or glorified comes in the hour of God's greatest humiliation. Rather than thinking of the crucifixion as the absence of God with the darkening skies and the cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is actually the moment when God's presence is most evident. God shows himself in the crucifixion through a palpable darkness, an earthquake, and a tearing of the temple curtain in two. Compare this event with the darkening skies thundering and God's voice at Mount Sinai. God's great moment in history comes when all seems lost, when God seems defeated. God's glory is revealed in God's self-humiliation. No, the crucifixion was no act of divine child abuse. It was the history-defining event in which God gave his very self for humanity's sake. So that's the end of chapter 5. Next time we'll look at chapter 6, God's timeless wisdom, incremental steps for hardened hearts. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And please keep an eye out for my published work, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. It's a commentary, expositional, devotional commentary on the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms. Thank you for praying for this ministry, and stay tuned for the next installment of Blessed Man Meditations. Have a blessed rest of your day.